Hi, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive for Sergei Eisenstein, Films That Shook the World. A big shout out to Susan and Kevin Conzi for their sponsorship of this series. Thank you very, very much. And in other thanks, we thank the Trust for Mutual Understanding, who helped us with the underwriting of some travel of guest scholars for this weekend, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts for the Out of the Vault presentation, which we had on Friday afternoon. This series dovetails with another series here at BAMPFA, Sergei Eisenstein and His Contemporaries, which is a Wednesday afternoon class being taught by Ann Nesbitt. Ann Nesbitt is at UC Berkeley and is in the Slavic and Film and Media departments. That's a wonderful Wednesday afternoon lecture screening series. Tickets are available for each show, so if you'd like to join us, there's still a lot ahead, including this coming Wednesday's presentation of The New Babylon, which has it's a brilliant film from 1929 by Leonid Trauberg, Kozintsev and Trauberg, the two Soviet filmmakers who worked together a lot, and it has a Shostakovich score. We will be joined by Peter Bogrov, who is also joining us this afternoon for discussions with Ann Nesbitt. But when we first planned this series, of course, we wanted to welcome Naum Kleiman, the preeminent Eisenstein authority based in Moscow, and quite late in the game, he had to cancel his trip and he sent his regrets. We regrouped and in fact brought in a number of scholars for this opening weekend of the series. So we're so pleased that this afternoon, Joan Neuberger is here with us to help present Ivan the Terrible, parts 1 and 2, alongside Peter Bogrov. Joan is based in Austin at the University of Texas. She's published a lot on Eisenstein and on early Russian and Soviet cinema. She is the co-editor of an upcoming Festschrift. In fact, I think it's just out. The Flying Carpet Studies on Eisenstein in Russian Cinema in honor of Naum Kleiman. As well, soon out will be a new book on Ivan the Terrible, the title of which is, oh my goodness, I just scribbled it down. Joan, I'm going to ask you to give your book title when you come down. Forgive me, but this is coming out very soon and will be very exciting. And we're thrilled to have you as an authority on Ivan the Terrible. Joan will set up part 1, and after this part 1 session, she'll be joined by Peter Bogrov. I'll just say that Peter is a film scholar from Moscow and has been working until quite recently at Gosfilmofond of Russia, the state archive in Russia that has a lot of the Soviet films. And then Peter will set up Ivan the Terrible Part 2 and be joined by Joan afterwards. I believe a lot of us are doing the entire afternoon session. Please help me in a warm welcome for Joan Neuberger.
Thank you, Susan. So I hope that in the fall you'll all look for my book, which is called This Thing of Darkness, Ivan the Terrible in Stalin's Russia, and Ivan the Terrible. It's great to see such a large audience here for this, and it's such a unique experience to get to see 35 millimeter print on the big screen. I've been looking at this film on my phone, for many, many years. And Ivan the Terrible really is Eisenstein's masterpiece. He's probably better known for Battleship Potemkin, but it's my mission in life to make it clear that his real masterpiece is Ivan the Terrible. This is a film that was butchered by censorship, that was unfinished, and is still really a masterpiece. But it's not really an easy film, and in fact, my students often walk out going, "What was that about?" So one of the reasons that it can be difficult to understand what it's about is that Eisenstein believed that the way to convey ideas and the way to convey feelings about things was to do it through contradictions and conflicts and collisions that of ideas, of feelings, of images, of things, of music and images, of emotions and thoughts. And so Ivan the Terrible is presented really as a kind of contradictory figure. On the one hand, the film was commissioned by Stalin in 1941 to provide a kind of historical pedigree for the Soviet government and for Stalin's own centralized government, and to justify the reign of terror that Stalin had just unleashed on the Soviet Union. So that makes a very contradictory kind of figure. Ivan is represented as being really triumphant. He has a lot of victories in part one and again in part two, but he's also represented in some ways that are dark and sinister and hard to understand. It's also complicated because Eisenstein didn't really like telling stories the way we're used to thinking of films telling stories. He was kind of the anti-Hollywood for a lot of people at the time. And he believed that the way to, as I said, to convey ideas and feelings was to ratchet up your feelings, to portray people doing things with such intensity, with increasing intensity, so that the way their bodies moved, the way they interacted with each other, the way they interacted with the things around them would be increasingly emotionally wrought. And so I just want to give you some things to think about as you're watching. Watch the way the camera watch the way the camera is actually fairly immobile in this film, but the cuts bring you closer and closer to people. Some people come zooming at the camera. Try and be conscious maybe of how that makes you feel and how that interacts with the ideas you're having about what's going on. And keep an eye on the things that surround, that are in the set, that are in the production design. And just try and pay attention to the contradictions. And I think I'll just stop there. Okay, great.
Okay, so we're going to welcome Joan Neuberger and Peter Bogrov for a opportunity to discuss this film first together and then with you, and we will close off the conversation in about 20 minutes, which will give everyone a chance to have a break if you're staying for Ivan the Terrible Part 2 starting at 4:30. And we would really appreciate it if you do need to get a bite or that you eat outside the theater, as there's no food or drink in the theater. Okay, I'm going to pass that to you.
I think so.
Well, do you want to say something first? You are the expert on this film. Sorry, I just want to ask a question, which we ask every time.
We'll let Peter start.
Yes, just a question. Who hasn't seen this film before? Great.
Yes, great. So, masterpiece, right? I think the thing that I'm always really struck by when I watch part one, especially by itself, is that is the politics between Ivan and the opposition and all the questions that it raises. So on the surface, it seems as if the film is saying Ivan sets out this visionary policy. He's going to centralize the state. He's going to make Russia strong. He's going to protect it against all its enemies. But by doing that, he creates all sorts of opposition, right? There are all sorts of people and institutions that are opposed to that. So throughout the film, we're constantly seeing him pushing ahead to create the Great Russian State, to found the Great Russian State. And there's constant opposition, right? And the sort of the surface narrative is that Ivan is right, that the Great Russian State has to be founded. But at the same time, I think we're always being asked, just like he's always asking himself, am I doing the right thing? Is he doing the right thing? Does it make sense to create this kind of instability and opposition and violence or potential violence, all in the name of what? All in the name of security? All in the name of a centralized state? Taking power away from other people? Which is it? And in the Stalinist context, where a centralized, very powerful, violent state had been formed in the name of the people, in the name of a revolution that started off with egalitarian principles, that had a particular resonance.
Right, I'd just like to add a few more purely historical comments, which was John knows better, in case somebody doesn't know the case. You know, he was the first Russian Tsar. Before that, there were great princes, Veliki Knyaz, but he was the one who basically appointed himself as Tsar. So this is one thing. And then besides, I think those of you who have seen Alexander Nevsky yesterday, also there was no such a thing as Russia. You know, Russia was just like Germany, a set of small little principal kingdoms in a way, right? So he was really the one who who united the country. But the question here is at what price? And we will talk more about, of course, the fate of the film. But this is the first part of the film, which was commissioned by Stalin, and which was the biggest production of the war period. And the Russian war, Russia was in the Second World War not from 39 but from 41 till 45. So in those 3.5 years of war, yeah, 3.5, this was the most important production in the whole country. It was shot not in Moscow, not in Leningrad, because it was based in Moscow, the Mosfilm, but in the Middle Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, where the main film studios and some of the theaters were evacuated. So they had a possibility of gathering huge forces, artistic forces, of filmmakers, of actors, of everyone, and I would say a huge budget, considering, of course, the situation of the war. And the film was mostly shot at nights because they needed the power, the electric power, which during the daytime was used for factories and plants. So when the factories went off, the filmmaking started, right? So this is sort of how important the film was for Stalin, for sort of like this, the country in its defense. So it was an absolutely commissioned film. It was a tremendous success, not only artistically and for the audience, but with the powers, and it got the highest prize possible, the Stalin Prize, for the first part. And the fate of the second part was completely the opposite.
Right. I think I said it. I can't remember if I said in the introduction that this film was commissioned by Stalin in January 1941, and it was part of a campaign to create a historical pedigree for Soviet power. And actually, what Ivan does during this period in centralizing the government and creating a single army, that was something that rulers were doing all over Europe at the time. So it could be justified on those grounds as well. But again, always keeping in the sense that this was taking place under Stalin, and so part one was very well received, or at least that's the way it seems. It got good reviews. It was finished at the end of 1944. It was released to the public at the beginning of 1945, and within weeks it was even being shown on the front because the tide of the war had already turned in the winter of 1943, but of course it was going on through 1945. It wasn't over in Russia until May. But during the pre-release screenings, when the film was shown to the film industry to be censored, almost everyone who saw it as being terrifying, and saw it as being and didn't believe that Stalin would like it. So actually several scenes were removed from part one that would have made it even darker and more sinister. So by the time Stalin saw it, those scenes had been removed. And then when it came up for a Stalin Prize, like everybody kind of knows that part one won the Stalin Prize and part two was banned. Not everybody. But it's historically known that part one won the Stalin Prize and then part two was banned immediately after Stalin saw it. And so one of the big historical questions is, why did Stalin like part one and why didn't he like part two? And since he banned it immediately, it seemed like, well, that must have been way more politically challenging. But in fact, part one was just as the film that Eisenstein conceived was just as challenging as part two, but a number of these scenes had been removed. And then when it came before the Stalin Prize Committee, that is the group of artists who were to decide which films would win the Stalin Prize, no one wanted to send it forward to Stalin to make the final decision because they all saw it as being much too politically subversive. And the real question is why Stalin was willing to, because ultimately it became his choice, why he was willing to give it the prize. We don't really know the answer to that, except that a portrait of the Tsar as someone who was cruel and violent. Well, he wasn't really violent in part one yet, but someone who was cruel, who was just beginning to arrest boyars, and who was willing to, really do whatever he needed to do in order to centralize the state. That was something that Stalin saw as being a very positive thing.
Well, that's one thing, and another thing which I could add to this is that, of course, the late 1930s, 1936, 37, 38, was the time of the big purges, the big arrests, and the main idea of this paranoid country, so Soviet Union, was the idea of the enemies of the state who were everywhere, and who should be, seeked and searched and destroyed, at least arrested, but probably destroyed. And this was everywhere in the papers, and so here we see that exactly this, and people did believe in this. There are still people who are 80 years old, 90 years old, who believe in those things, and unfortunately there is a tendency
Believe that there were enemies.
that there were enemies. Yeah, yeah, there were probably a couple, but and the problem is that it is being, there was a new tendency of the Stalinization of Soviet history, but that's another story. But the thing is that, so here we see that Ivan was facing exactly the same problems as Stalin is facing, and so Ivan was forced to apply cruelty in order to save the country. And so if Ivan's cruelty is justified, so is Stalin's cruelty in many ways. But another thing which there were two reasons, I guess, why the first part, well, horrified the artist. It's not only because of the politics, the history, but of course because of its artistic solution, artistic style. Because 1930s was the time of the so-called socialist realism, and the main slogan was that everything has to be very typical, a very typical acting, very realistic, very naturalistic, but of course with a very clear social and socialist, communist, utopian, I would say, message at the end. So everything is good, everything is fine, but you have to play it realistically. And so we've all been talking about the realistic styles of Chekhov and Tolstoy, right? Well, we have nothing like this here in this film. And many films in the 30s were banned for the so-called formalism, when so there were abstract forms of visual forms, abstract, unusual, unrealistic forms of acting, of talking, of speech. We have all of this here, and this was quite enough for a film to be banned in 1935, 36, 37. And Belgian Meadow, Eisenstein's lost and banned and masterpiece, was accused of those things, among other things too. There is a wonderful memoir of his Eisenstein's friend, the great theatrical critic Josef Józefsky, written in the 50s, who saw this film, loved the film because he was very much, he was impressed by the film. And he said, you know what, I have the feeling as if you dragged me through a great art gallery, a big museum, where every single shot is a masterpiece, and I'm completely crushed by those shots. I don't get what the film is really about, because I cannot really follow the narrative. I cannot follow the dialogues. I'm just completely, killed by the visuals. And what is the point of this? What is the film about? What is the real plot? And Eisenstein's reply was, you know what? The reason that this is not the film, this is part one. You have to get used to the style. You have to be in this universe. And in the second part, you will know what this is all about.
Yeah, he was actually worried that part one would be he wanted part one and part two to be released at the same time, not because part two was too negative and sinister, but because he was afraid that part one would seem too pale if it was released by itself. But I also wanted to say that I loved hearing everybody laughing at points during the film. He absolutely wanted people to laugh. He believed that laughter brought out like Shakespeare, that laughter brought out the tragedy and the pathos of what was going on. And the same thing with melodramatic acting, the sort of melodramatic style. He also was a big fan of melodrama as a genre, because it was sort of everything sort of black and white, everything's really good, really evil. And he loved the idea of bringing those two things together, of bringing totally unrealistic, overacting, exaggerated acting, to often to the point of laughing at it, because that would also make you aware of what was so sad and tragic and worrisome about it.
I'd like to catch up, because melodrama is maybe the most important word here, and it's not melodrama like Casablanca. It is melodrama like melodrama. It's a drama with music, in a way, which was the initial definition of melodrama. And Eisenstein really knew those things. What is a new melodrama? What is the original melodrama? And the thing is, we have been talking about those contrasts, black and white, like yesterday, those of you have seen Nevsky, where white was the color of death, period. Now, here we see those contrasts, and they change places all the time. It is not that black is the color of evil and white is the color of good. They are in this shot. and they change place in the next one. And you really have to be aware of this ambiguity. And by the end of the film, you're completely confused. Because, well, in the poisoning scene, right, there is, of course, the innocent Anastasia, and I'll talk later about her, who is the only artistic flop in this film. And then we see two horrifying faces, absolutely horrifying. The face of the aunt, who is, of course, evil, and the face of Ivan's closest, friend and assistant, and his main hangman, executioner Maluta Skuratev, who is as horrible as her face. And they're the two opposite, sides of the battle.
And we also see Yefrosinia and Anastasia being paired in the same way. And there's and Eisenstein always wanted, Stanislavski said, always look for the good in the villain. And every single character in this film, no matter how evil, has a little bit of good. No matter how good, has a little bit of evil. And there's a great moment in that poisoning scene just before Anastasia drinks the poison. She lowers it a little bit, and Yefrosinia rises. It's like a little seesaw, rises there, and there's just a moment of doubt because we've just seen that Anastasia has been the whole reason that she needs this glass of water that Ivan frantically goes looking for is because she's heard that Kurbsky, who she kind of has this little flirtation with, may be a traitor.
At the least.
She believes, right? Yeah. So, and that's also typical of the whole film. Eisenstein's always looking for the contrast within in each individual character.
And well, it is also, of course, as Eisenstein always is, very much about geometrical forms, shapes, right? And there are two, I would say, use the German word, the musical word, leitmotifs. One is, of course, an arc, which appears constantly, and another one, which is, I would say, more or less, it doesn't have it's those straightforward symbols, but this one is more or less a symbol of death. It is the triangle. When we see all those triangular black monks entering the room, this triangular Bible which covers his face, when he is embracing Anastasia, horrified before his death scene, right? They do form this black triangle, and this is being followed, shot after a shot. And this is why in this film he needed another cameraman, because all of his previous films, starting from Strike, were shot by Edouard Tisset. Great cameraman, one of the best ones of his time. But for this film, he needed another man. He needed somebody who not only worked in the interiors, which Tisset was not really too good at, although Besh and Meadows suggest the opposite. Great shots, at least in static. But he needed somebody who knew sort of how to organize a shot before it is being filmed, and not just to capture this great realistic documentary moments, which Tisset was perfect at in Battleship Potemkin, in October, even in Nevsky, in the battle scene. And this is why I had Andrei Moskvin, one of the most sophisticated cameramen of his time. If we want to find an American analogy, it is, of course, Greg Toland, who shot Citizen Kane, right? Andrei Moskvin, who was this graphic artist, I would say, as a cameraman, using this Rembrandt chiaroscuro lighting. Those of you who would come here on Wednesday when the new Babylon is going to be screened, that is his great silent masterpiece. So he wanted somebody who is completely different, and not only because he was be able to turn Eisenstein's wonderful and complicated and very stylized drawings into realistic shots, but who could do these things like follow those triangles and arcs and many other different rhythms and rhymes without being reminded. And they did not discuss all the triangles because Moskvin just got the point, and then he was just finding them himself.
Yeah, and Eisenstein had a very different relationship with Moskvin than he did with Tisset. And you can see this in the letters that he wrote to them, or the notes and telegrams. He'd known Tisset for 20 years and still wrote in a fairly formal style to him. But his notes to Moskvin are immediately friendly and jokey, and they had a common language. And this is true of all of the main collaborators that worked on this film. Cherkasov, the actor, Moskvin, the cameraman, and Prokofiev, who wrote the score, which we also really need to talk about. But I think one of the things that's most important about these collaborations is that Eisenstein had a really great relationship with each of these men, and they were all men who were willing to take risks. Unlike Tisset, They were all really willing to make a film that Eisenstein knew was going to be challenging, and they were all willing to go in that direction in a way that Tissot wasn't actually.
But for those of you who are fans of Tissot, I have to say that the most
Yes, a big fan of Tissot, but not not for this.
But the most famous shot in the film, I guess, was made by Tissot. And this is when we see this, the snake, sort of this line of people on the snow, and Ivan's profile. That is Tissot. And this is, by the way, probably 95% a quote from a great Swedish film by Moritz Stiller, The Treasures of Sir Arne, which was shown in Russia and which was very popular. Eisenstein was really looking for those things, mostly in painting and in sculpture, but occasionally in film as well. I mean, we have a couple of minutes. Should we ask any questions, I guess? Ask 4 questions, if there are any.
We've got 2 mic runners. The first question is in the middle of this row.
What do I do with this? Okay. Could you speak more about Anastasia being a flop? I was kind of surprised. She's a passive character. She's sitting pretty, has a great set of fake eyelashes. Lashes seems fine to me.
Eisenstein really wanted. He had a lot of trouble casting the female characters, and he wanted someone more graceful. He wanted someone who could really move her body in more inventive ways. Anastasia plays the role like a doll. And I also think that it's not really the kind of acting that Eisenstein wanted, but it absolutely not the kind of acting that Eisenstein wanted. But on the other hand, I think she serves a function of providing a model of socialist realist acting, and the sort of adoring gaze that she gives to Ivan is a quote from almost every socialist realist film and painting. So in that sense, I would say if it's 90, I would call it 90% a flop and 5%, 10%. Sorry, my math not so good. 10% functional.
Yeah, I was going to talk about acting during my introduction to the second part, so I will not do it now. I will mostly discuss this. So, any other questions?
Yes, I have a question about the aesthetics of the film, which really struck me. I saw this film many, many years ago, so I was really interested in my response this time. And I found a lot of it sort of post-expressionist or expressionist. In fact, I thought on occasion of Dr. Caligari in some of the shots. As far as the painting goes, the painterly aspect of it, I was also struck by the painterly. And I thought of the Baroque as a Baroque painting in general. There's so many diagonals in this film. It is, in addition to triangles, and I don't remember what else you said.
Arcs.
Arcs, yeah. But so much of it is structured diagonally. And the diagonal is crucial for Baroque painting. And I was also struck by the excess of decor, the incredibly excessive decor. Some of it, and this is a question, some of it is clearly stylized. The church scene. In fact, I had a question about that. Where was that filmed? Probably somewhere in a big church, right? I doubt that you think they created the
They
set
built it.
for it?
They built it and they painted it.
Amazing.
Painted the light.
And they painted the
Oh,
light in, right?
okay.
Yeah. The frescoes in the film. Go ahead.
So, I guess by asking that question, the painterly aspect, the Baroque, the decorative, the excess of decor, which could also be perceived as Baroque, and the stylization of religious motifs struck me again as avant-garde. If you look at the walls, I would have to point them out so that. I guess I said enough, right? I said many different things. Thank you.
We were just dividing up the answer. Let me just say one quick word about the frescoes and the set. This was all built in Almaty. It's a huge set that was built in a kind of former school, I think, or warehouse or something in Almaty. The frescoes, Eisenstein wrote a lot about what he wanted the frescoes to do. He wanted them to represent, well, a lot of different things. But for one thing, he wanted them to remind Ivan to be a. He wanted them to be like memories of childhood, and he wanted them to seem like the way a child. He wanted the whole set to be seen the way a child has, an adult remembers his childhood memories. So that's why there's a lot of distortion. That's why there's a lot of stylization, because in our memories we remember things in different proportions. They're absolutely techniques of the avant-garde, and the Baroque, and
Well, and expressionist filmmaking, of course. I would not think specifically of Dr. Caligari, but you're absolutely right about the German expressionism, because one director with whom Eisenstein was fascinated with, absolutely, was Fritz Lang, of course. And he was a follower, of course, of Caligari, and you can see it in many films, especially in the sound one, surprisingly. So Eisenstein was completely unexpressionistic in the silent era. He was going the documentary direction. Yeah, you're right. But in the sound one, all of a sudden he turns back to back to that direction. In Alexander Nevsky, which is in many ways influenced by Die Nibelungen, by Fritz Lang. And here is, of course, the culture of silent cinema in general, which was pretty much forgotten by that time. And I would say that if it was stylized silent cinema, symbolic silent cinema, it would be 95% German silent cinema for them. Yeah, so you're right.
There's a gentleman with a microphone, and let's just do. I'm sorry. Okay, this will have to be our last
Please.
comment for this session, so that we can still have 20 minutes for our break.
Hello? Yeah. My question is very simple. Could you set this in history? When was Ivan, and what was the structure of society? I've seen this film several times, but I never really knew what the boyars are. I think of them.
Fair enough.
So,
Ivan came to power in 1547, and as I said, the way. So what he did was very typical of what European rulers were doing at the same time. Actually, in some cases, a century earlier, they were creating centralized states. Reducing the power of the feudal aristocracy, which is what the boyars were, more or less, creating centralized armies that would serve to protect the country as a whole. So this is when France was created as a country, under the same kind of process. What happened in Russia, though, is that the aristocracy that Ivan carried it out not just with kind of institutional changes, but with massive and very controversial, even to this day, reign of violence, of terror, that murdered boyars, that is, members of the aristocracy, members of the landed gentry, members of the peasantry, members of the urban classes as well. And the reason why it's controversial is because it was so random. Well, we don't have that many documents, and because it was so random, it's been hard to explain. It can't really be explained the way Stalin wanted to explain it, which was as progressive for its time, that is, as ridding the country of the greedy aristocracy and the greedy church, because that's not the way it was carried out. Is that enough? Yes, you're welcome.
Just and one last comment. It's very simple what I wanted to add, but sometimes people don't really realize it. Ivan the Terrible is not the perfect translation, because when you hear the Terrible, it is a villain. Now, Ivan Grozny in Russian is Ivan the Thunderous, Ivan the
Awesome.
Yes. So it is a bit horrifying, but it's not Ivan the Bad, right? Sorry. Formidable, maybe formidable. I was thinking of another word actually.
Awe-inspiring, right?
Yeah,
But also groza is thunder.
Thunder, right? So
We
taking
see the storm at the beginning, the clouds. We see
the
them
language of
again
the
and
16th
again.
century, right? So we have to take this into account as well.
Perfect. So let's
Thank
take our
you.
20-minute break. We'll start at 4:30. Hi, welcome back for Ivan the Terrible Part 2 as part of our Sergei Eisenstein Films That Shook the World retrospective that continues until April 25th. And I wanted to mention again that this Eisenstein retrospective dovetails with our Wednesday matinee series. It's a lecture screening series led by Ann Nesbitt here from UC Berkeley's Slavic Film and Media departments. And we will be presenting Ivan the Terrible Part 1 and Part 2 on 2 Wednesdays in April. I believe it's Wednesday, April 18th and 25th. So a wonderful chance to see these films again with a scholarly context around it. I also want to take this opportunity to mention that Naum Kleiman sent his regrets that he couldn't be our guest for this 10-day period to launch the Eisenstein retrospective. But my colleague Kathy Garretts, in her Reverse Angle Cinema Looks at Itself thematic series in this calendar, has scheduled Cinema, a Public Affair. And this is a documentary, a German documentary from 2015 that really looks at Naum Kleiman's work and a very interesting piece. So that's Thursday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. It's in our program guide. Check that out in the Reverse Angle series. Now, it's a pleasure to welcome Peter Rogrov. As I've mentioned several times in recent days, he's here as our archivist in residence. He's traveled in from Moscow, where he has, in recent years, worked as the senior curator at Gosfilmofond of Russia, the state archive, and is currently serving in a voluntary capacity as the vice president of FIAF, the International Federation of Film Archives. And through the years that I've known Peter and where he's helped me when I've done research in Moscow, he is a hero in our field because Peter is often helping scholars and curators around the world to learn more about Russian cinema, to learn more about where rare prints can be found, and also sharing his own expertise in early Russian and Soviet cinema. So Peter's going to set up part 2. Peter Rogrov.
Thank you, Susan. I wanted to say that it's actually, well, a treat for me to see those films in a row on the big screen with a big and very responsive audience. It's quite a different experience. It really is. I liked some of the things much better this time than when I saw them before, and I saw them several times. So a few things which I wanted to say before watching part 2, and then John and I would discuss the film later after you watch it. So this was, as we mentioned, the most ambitious project of the wartime in Russian cinema, made in Middle Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Almaty. And Eisenstein, who was not a very easy man, we've mentioned his relationship with Edouard Tissé, who had to be replaced by Moskvin, and it was a real tragedy for Tissé, which he never really was able to overcome. And Eisenstein was very often criticized for his selfishness, for his cruelty, which did exist. For example, with his relationship with women, there was correspondence, and he was. But the thing is that this film was quite an event, because the team that worked with him, the crew, the cast, it was, shall I say, a sect of a sort. Because it was really sort of a trademark, being a member of this crew. For those who lived for 10, 20, 50, 60 years, I managed to know some of them. They're all gone by now. The last one died a few years ago, his assistant director. But while they were alive, they were always meeting. Eisenstein died only 3 years later, and this was his last film. And I would say that this production killed him in a way. We'll discuss it later, what really happened to the film and to him afterwards. And the cameraman Andrei Moskvin, some of the film historians consider him the greatest cameraman of his time, and definitely the best one in Russia. He was a man of quite a peculiar character. He rarely spoke. He was a great master of lighting. So when he wanted to show his assistants where the camera should be put and where the the lights should be put, he would very accurately spit on the floor, which was very typical of him. He worked with some of the directors, and great directors, for decades, and was sarcastic to say the least when talking about them. And he absolutely fell in love with Eisenstein. Absolutely. Nobody ever received such long and emotional letters from Moskvin as Eisenstein did. Naum Klemen, who is mentioned here every day, and who is the best, I guess, Eisenstein scholar, approached Moskvin in 1960 when he was a student, when Klemen was a student, and wanted to ask him about Eisenstein. And Moskvin very rudely, abruptly, kicked him away. And then Moskvin called Eisenstein's widow, Pera Atasheva, and said, there is an impudent young man who wants to talk about Eisen, is how he was called by his friends. Why the hell should I talk to anyone about him? And she says, well, he is really somebody. You really should make an exception. She says, well, okay, he can talk to me. I give my permission. And when Naum came half a year later, Moskvin was dead. So we don't have this interview. But this is just something to say that Moskvin didn't love anyone in the film industry, with one single exception. And then I would like to say a few words about the actors and acting in this film. So, of course, as always with Eisenstein, this is not method acting, by no ways. But he had this privilege, I would say, to use all the artistic forces of the country. It was, again, the most important film production of the time, and in Middle Asia, not only in Kazakhstan, but in Uzbekistan and a few other republics, there were gathered, the main Russian theaters and the main Russian film companies, so he could take whoever he wanted. And he picked all of them for a very specific reason, or reasons, shall I say. He picked those who could act, what he would say, in a Japanese style. He was a great amateur of, a great fan and admirer of kabuki, of the kabuki theater, and he was describing many times to his students the most primitive and simple of all the examples, when in one of the many Japanese suicide plays, when the character is about to commit harakiri, and the gesture that he makes has to correlate with the sound that he pronounces and with the musical instrument that is heard in the background. All these have to match. So this is what he wants from his actors. They should work on all the levels possible. And this is why he chose Nikolai Cherkasov for the part of Ivan, who was a wonderful comedian with a tendency to be a clown, to be a circus actor in a way. He really loved this, but his ability to work with his body was miraculous. And you could see, for example, in the first part, the way he played, the death scene. He didn't die, but when he was ill, which was, I would say, just impossible physically, because he had to stretch his arm this way and put his head this way and say something at the same time, and look on the other side. It was very difficult physically. Or when he kneels finally, and you see the straight line starting from his knee and ending with his shoulder, right? So he was to play a line, because lines, as we mentioned before, were the main things in Eisenstein's philosophy of art, not only film, art in general. Because he was surrounded by blueprints in blueprints of his father, the architect, in his childhood, and so he needed somebody who could play a line, who could be an animation, character in a way. And this applied to many other actors. It is interesting how he chose them. For example, there are many actors who are not film stars. There are two in the first part. There are two ambassadors. One of them, who looks like a bird, this arrogant one. I mean, they all resemble animals, of course, as you see. Was played by Alexander Rumnev, one of the greatest avant-garde choreographers of the 20s. A very eccentric character, very atypical, openly gay, nothing but was typical of the Soviet artists of the time. And the other ambassador with the strange glasses, right, is played by Semyon Tymoshenko, a wonderful film director and one of the few theorists of editing and montage. There was this madman with the chains, over ecstatic and hysterical. Well, this is one of the greatest Soviet directors, Vsevolod Pudovkin. right, and so forth. The deacon in the church is one of the best opera singers in the country, Maxim Mikhailov, who was in fact a deacon when he was when he was in his early 20s, and then who quit his church career to become a great opera singer. Right, and so he needed this combination of unrealistic, uncinematic acting with a sense of something else, whether it is, well, a real religious act or an opera or a ballet. Speaking of ballet, so why really is Anastasia, the wife, such a flop? Because he had a specific actress in mind, not an actress. Galina Ulanova, the greatest ballet dancer in Russia of the 20th century. This is Prokofiev's music, right? Ulanova was Prokofiev's first Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. And I guess the best one, fortunately, we have her in film. And Eisenstein loved to dance himself, during parties. Women did not like to dance with him because they thought he was clumsy. He didn't have a sense of rhythm. There was one person who loved to dance with him, and this was Galina Ulanova, the great ballet dancer, because she thought that his sense of rhythm is the sense of rhythm of a ballet dancer, not of a regular guy at a party. Maybe just a few more names. There was a tremendous job done by Serafima Birman, who is playing the aunt. Now, she was, I would say, the ultimate method actress. She was the one who really learned method directly from Stanislavski, and the first one, she was this experimental rabbit, and Stanislavski was her god. But she made this exception for Eisenstein because she thought that he has the other pole, I would say, the anti-pole of reality, and she wanted to take the challenge. When Eisenstein had a habit of watching, acting, we can talk about this for hours, because every second bit part is played by somebody really important in the world of theater, opera, ballet, cinema, whatever. But whenever he was watching some of the outtakes, some of the edited and unedited footage, he liked to take two people with him. One is Amvrosy Buchma, who is playing Alexei Basmanov, the head of the Oprichniki, the one who appears with his son at the end of the film. Now, Alexei Buchma was the greatest Ukrainian actor, who always had a pretty heavy Ukrainian accent when he was speaking Russian. And this is what he wanted. He wanted somebody with another musical ear, with another sense of language. And Ukrainian language is much closer to the original Russian language than the contemporary Russian one is. So he wanted really him. Well, he was a brilliant actor. And the other one, and he was a very experienced actor, playing classical literature for decades. And another one whom he always shared the experience of watching was Pavel Kadachnikov, who is playing, the insane cousin of his, right? Who was one of the least experienced actors. So he wanted two opposite opinions. And last but not least, I'd like to mention Mikhail Kuznetsov, who is playing the younger Basmanov, who appears, and there was this brilliant sequence which has been discussed wonderfully in a book on the film by Yuri Tsivian. One last thing. During the funeral sequence, when he turns from the coffin and Anastasia in white, and we see her face, and he turns and we see the face of this stunningly beautiful young man. By the way, he was not so stunningly beautiful in everyday life. This is how he was filmed by Moskvin. Now, Eisenstein had his very complicated theory of bisexuality. And he's often credited as a gay director. He's not a gay director, not only because he, had affairs with women, and men too, but because he had his theory of bisexuality. He wrote a lot about it, and his idea was that it is very closely connected to different historical stages. There was a bisexual mentality, and then there was a heterosexual mentality, and he belonged to the previous one. But turning from heterosexual, and Ivan was heterosexual first with a wife, to bisexual was his turning to progress, to regress. And when he turns backwards and see this man after this woman, this is a turning point in his politics, and the turning point, in a way, in the film, which you would experience now in the second part. So this young man is played by Mikhail Kuznetsov, a very realistic, very Soviet actor, always playing, contemporary young workers. Wonderful actor who was Eisenstein's most furious, ferocious opponent in this film, because he wanted a realistic explication for every single move he makes. He didn't want just to fit in the arc or in the triangle. So Eisenstein sent him to the zoo to examine, those who know Russian, what is the English word for bars? It's not a leopard, it's just leopard. Okay, well, it's a special kind of leopard. So to look at a leopard and to examine how he jumps. And then I'm forgetting my English. Another thing is, how do you call it when your eyes look a little bit to the cross-eyed? Right, exactly. So he has to be a bit cross-eyed like this leopard. And why was that? Because in the third part, which was never completed, when he was about to be murdered, killed by the Tsar, and he is the last friend that the Tsar betrays, friend and lover, the Tsar kills him before he is to kill the Tsar. And the Tsar looks at him, and he sees the cross-eyed expression for the first time, because he is looking aside. And this is when the Tsar realizes that he is actually untrue to him, and he is about to betray him. And this when he is about to be killed. And then this cross-eyed Fyodor Basmanov, realizing this, jumps at the Tsar, exactly trying to recreate the plastics of the movements of a leopard. And when he jumps and when he flies at him, there is a knife which blinks, and he falls on this knife, right? So this is how he worked with actors. But first when he was sent to the zoo and said, just look at a leopard. Why? Said he. I need an explication. And so Eisenstein, while working with different actors, had a different method for everyone. Well, so enjoy the second part, and then we'll be happy to talk more about it, because this can go forever.
And following the close of the film, we'll need a couple minutes. We'll go into the discussion, but then we will also have a chance to see the interrogation scene, which either was part of part 2 or potentially a scene from part 3 for the scholars to debate. Okay.
We'll talk for a couple of minutes, then you'll see the little clip which was not included in the film, and then we'll talk more, right?
Yeah, maybe I'll tell you about the history of making of these last parts, because so part 1, which you saw earlier, was finished at the end of 1944, and then Eisenstein it took him another whole year to finish 1945. I mean, to finish part 2. Sorry, all of 1945. He was back in Moscow. He came back to Moscow in the middle of 1944. But everyone else had sort of spread around the country. Remember, Peter said that the actors and everyone else came from all over. Moskvin was somewhere else. Prokofiev, who wrote the score, suffered a concussion in February and didn't want to finish the music. He wanted Eisenstein to use a different composer. And so he did a little shooting in February of that year, and then it wasn't until late in the year, actually in November, that they shot all the scenes that you see in color. So in fact, all these delays actually led to one of the most amazing things that happened, which is that they got some color film, some Agfa color film from Germany as war treasure, war booty. And so Eisenstein had wanted to, I'll let Peter talk about this a little bit more, but Eisenstein had wanted to, for a long time, he wanted to shoot a color film, and was able to then make these last couple scenes in color. But because of all the delays, the film studio was threatening to take the film away from him and give it to someone else, because he was just taking his time making it perfect. And finally, in the beginning of December, they said, if you don't finish this film by January 1st, we're going to take it away and give it to someone else. And so he wrote out this incredible schedule, which would be basically causing him to work 24 hours a day, rehearsing and setting up and getting the costumes made and the music synced, written, actually. Prokofiev finally wrote the music in the fall. And then sort of very, very quickly shot these great scenes at the end of the Feast of the Oprichniki and the Dance of the Oprichniki, and also the first scene from this part, which is all the scene in the Polish court. So that was all shot in December 1945. And then the prizes for the Stalin prizes for the year before were announced in January. Eisenstein turned in the film on February 6th, And he went that night to a party to celebrate all the Stalin prizes for the previous year. And he was dancing, as Peter said, he loved to dance. He was dancing with an actress, and he had a heart attack. Yeah.
Not a fatal one yet.
Not yet. He managed to survive. He always said that afterwards he was living on borrowed time, but he managed to survive. He wasn't able to sit up for another 2 months. He spent most of the spring in the hospital. Part 2, he had turned in, though. He wrote some memos to Moskvin to fix some of the color, which apparently Moskvin did in February. And then it was but before that, the ministry was so worried about this film, they had seen parts of it already, that they called in Mikhail Rom, another great director, and some other directors and people from the film studio to look at it. They said, listen, we think this is kind of problematic. What do you think? And when Rome writes in his memoirs that when they saw it, they realized that they couldn't show this to Stalin, that it would just totally freak him out, which in fact it did. So it was screened for Stalin on March 2nd. And we have a couple eyewitnesses accounts of what happened that night. Bolshakov, who was head of the film industry, arranged all the screenings for Stalin loved movies, and he watched movies several nights a week. But Bolshakov wouldn't even talk about this screening for months afterwards. Finally, he told a few friends what happened, and then they related it to one of his assistants who wrote down what happened. Apparently, after the screening, he came back to the studio, and he was not himself. His face was all blotchy, and he wouldn't talk to anybody. At the screening, when the lights finally went up, Stalin said, "This isn't a film. This is some kind of a nightmare." It's always written as some kind of nightmare in Russian, but I actually think he probably used some other words there. It's a something else kind of nightmare. He and his pals, his henchmen who watched it that night, started hurling epithets at it and swearing at it and saying, this isn't, this is just not okay. And within 3 days, it was banned by the Central Committee. So now that's actually a good setup for this.
I think we'll talk about about the color sequence and the visual things after the little thing we're going to watch now. I'll just say a few words about this little scene, which is usually referred to as a scene from part 3. And the thing is that it is not like what was written very often in the 90s, that Eisenstein wanted to make a Stalinist film. He made part 1. Then he realized that he's going to make this anti-Stalinist film, made part 2. Of course, had all of it in mind. He shot some of the scenes, at the same time, simultaneously, not all of them. The scene which you're going to see was supposed to be in part 2. So this part 2 opens with a scene at the Polish court, with this wonderful, game of chess. Basically, they are playing a game of chess, and the floor does look like a chess.
Homoerotic game of chess.
The ladies as well. It's bisexual, let's say. It's more. And the ladies, by the way, are mostly silent film stars who he picked again for their very specific, visual looks, which would not really fit the Russian part of the film. And then there is a knight who looks a little bit like a robot in this a bit too much armor. And so this knight was to be sent from Poland to Ivan's court as a spy by the court jester, by the fool. This was not even filmed, it was only planned. How he was being sent to court. But then the scene when he does appear at Ivan's court, this German knight, and he wrote memoirs, which were one of the sources for Eisenstein when he was thinking of the film, and it was filmed. It was a bit too gruesome, even for the second part. So then they decided to postpone including this scene in the film, and to wait until part 3, where Ivan gets completely mad, until a very strange sort of a patriotic, light, religious, in a way, ending. So it does exist with a very important dialogue. You're going to see it with subtitles, but with no music, because Prokofiev was to add music later. We do not know when exactly it was excluded from the film, from from part 2. But so it is known as part 3, and this is not the only thing which was made for part 3. He shot a few more scenes, which existed in his. He had some of the reels at his home. They were taken by somebody, by the authorities after his death in 1948, and never resurfaced. and the rest was stored at Mosfilm in Moscow. And when in the early 1950s, Stalin had the idea of reshooting all the biopics and making some more in color, in complete color. Another Nevsky, a complete new Ivan the Terrible. And so Ivan the Terrible was to be made by Ivan Pyryev, I think a brilliantly talented director, a very controversial figure who knew Eisenstein forever since the 20s. His son, Eric Pyryev, is playing little Ivan in this film because the father was, in a way, a tyrant, and the son had these qualities as well. And Eisenstein saw how he, acted when he was playing with other kids, and he wanted this to be, the future Ivan the Terrible. And so Pyryev was very eager to make the film and to make his version of Ivan. And according to the legend, he was the one who ordered the material of the third part to be destroyed. Knowing pretty much about Pyryev, I do not quite believe this. I mean, he really played evil more than he was. So there is a very, very, very slight chance of something resurfacing at Mosfilm. Let's not set too much hopes, but it is possible. But in the meantime, so let's watch this sequence of this meeting of Ivan and this the German knight Staden, and then we'll talk about the film a bit more. Here is a wonderful example of Eisenstein's humor, of Moskvin's humor. You mentioned expressionist. Well, this is one of the most expressionist scenes in the whole film, and in many ways of Stalin's humor, very typical of him. And we really, John mentioned this before during this little conference that we had. This is something we know about Stalin now, and which really Eisenstein did not know, but this is absolutely his type of joking.
Kind of manipulative and humiliating joking. And we see it at the feast also.
I just wanted to say one thing before we talk about Prokofiev, because we have been asked to, of course. There is one thing. There are many. We've been talking about some influences from the fine art, and Olga mentioned El Greco, and of course Ivan himself was modeled after an El Grecon, a typical El Grecon character. One thing which I realized after watching the film, I don't know, 10 times, I never realized it before, which is quite remarkable, that if you notice, Ivan, of course, he gets older and older and he changes, but nobody else does. Because he ages severely, and the people are the same. So this is what is quite mystical, in the film, and people really don't think it is wrong sometimes. So it really works. But speaking of influence, did you guess what was one of the main influences for the last, dramatic sort of twist of the plot when the cousin is killed instead of the Tsar in his clothes? Does it remind you of a very, very classical work of art, not film? Well, the one that Eisenstein mentioned was Rigoletto, the Verdi opera. Not that it was modeled after the opera, but just one of those things. But I would say that there are two very important plays that we should keep in mind, and there are two things in general which, of course, made Stalin furious. One is the obvious one, that he really becomes a crazy maniac, but there was one which he hated even more. Now, there were two plays, theatrical plays, which Stalin dearly hated and which were not staged in his lifetime. One is a play by Pushkin, Boris Godunov, which was one of the things which Eisenstein loved, and he wanted his adaptation anyway of this play. And there is the Mussorgsky opera, and you could see some reminiscence of this opera in Prokofiev's score here. And another one, and this was almost, a cursing word, was Hamlet. He absolutely hated Hamlet. And Hamletism was something, he accused his enemies of Hamletism. And the regret, the remorse, the doubt that the Tsar has, this is something which he hated much more than the cruelty, this Hamletism, right? And so this is something which, and of course Eisenstein had this play in mind too, as Pushkin had this play in mind while he was writing his Boris Godunov, which Eisenstein later used for this thing. So this is what I just wanted to say.
Yeah, Hamlet's really important. Obviously, my really favorite scene is the play within a play, the liturgical play, which is like the mousetrap in Hamlet, meant to shame the king into confessing, and has the opposite effect. I also hope that you noticed all. Peter talked earlier about the animals, about sending Fedkov, sending the actor who played Fedkov to the zoo. A lot of the actors and actresses are sort of meant to look like animals. And Eisenstein believed that when we feel our most primal feelings, that we often feel like we are animals. And he was really interested in all the ethnography of societies where people believed that they turned into animals. So that was something that he really loved. And I could talk about this for a while too, but I think we should really talk about Prokofiev and about the music. Leitmotifs is something, sort of musical motifs that are associated with characters, is something that we're familiar with today. It seems sort of very common, but it's something that Wagner invented and was new in the middle of the 20th century. And Eisenstein used this sort of Wagner-esque way of, or Eisenstein wanted Prokofiev to write leitmotifs for each of the characters, but then he used the music. He decided where the pieces of music would go, and he used little bits of music to connect scenes that might not automatically be connected in your mind. So, for example, the poisoning theme that's associated with both the poisoning of Ivan's mother in the prologue, which is in a flashback here, and then the poisoning of Anastasia. That is used in those two scenes, and then it comes back again when Malyuta brings the chalice, brings the cup that she used to poison Anastasia at the end. And then it's used in a number of other places to sort of suggest reasons why Ivan might have a real desire for revenge against the Boyars. And so the music's also used sometimes to sort of in contrast. So in the poisoning scene where Yefrosinya poisons Anastasia, she's associated with this very, very harsh string music. And that's the only place where Prokofiev tells the string players to play right down near the bridge of their instruments, because it gives that extra harshness. And then Anastasia is associated with this much more lyrical theme. And occasionally they switch in that scene to do what I was talking about earlier, to show that they're really alike in some ways as much as they are black and white difference. So I don't know. There's a lot more we could talk about, but
Yeah, well, since we mentioned before that he had all the forces, artistic forces of the country, basically almost. So he could, pick the perfect voices for singing voices. So as we mentioned before, the deacon is played by a great opera singer, but we have this wonderful lullaby about the beaver, which she sings twice. And Serafim Birman, well, she had a singing voice, but definitely not. She couldn't sing it as well as should be here. So he wanted to pick somebody and discuss it with Prokofiev, who wouldn't sound like an opera singer, and who could match the features, the physical look of this creature. She's basically playing a rat, right? And so there was a singer who was famous for doing folk songs, national folk songs of all the nationalities in the whole Soviet Union, Georgian, Jewish, etc., named Irma Yaunzem, who was never associated with Prokofiev and with this type of music. But they needed this specific voice, and Prokofiev was happy to write something for her, knowing her characteristics, and she was happy to do this. And I think she matches perfectly, because when Birman is singing the song, and for the second time, she's doing it herself, and the voices almost completely match. Right, so this was done quite remarkably.
should we take some questions? Okay. So maybe one or two questions at the most.
I just was wondering about part 3, and what did Eisenstein envision for part 3?
A couple things happen in part 3. As you saw at the end here, Eisenstein says, my hands are free now. I've defeated all my internal enemies. And most of part 3 then is a kind of war scene, a kind of story of war and betrayal. So a lot of people ask, well, where's World War II in this movie? This is all going on. Why isn't there some echo of that? Well, in part 3, there was going to be a horrific battle in which Ivan orders the killing of everybody in Novgorod because that whole city had betrayed Ivan, and even the birds would be killed. So that's one of the stories, and then the other story has to do with the Basmanos, Fedka and Alexei. Peter referred to this earlier, but Eisenstein has Fedka kill his father for his father having been been embezzling from Ivan, and then Fedka comes back out, and Ivan says, "How can I trust you if you did this?" So that's when he has Fedka himself killed. So even though this clip was probably too harsh for part 2, it really represents the kind of manipulation, the kind of treatment of his own entourage that's so much like what the Bolsheviks did to their to the old Bolsheviks, to the revolutionaries during the time of the terror.
Maybe one more thing.
And then one thing is that the very last scene was to be this victory over the Livonians, over Kurbsky, over everybody. Everybody dies, Malyuta dies, everyone dies. Ivan gets to the sea, and it's both his apotheosis, his great victory, but then he also is all alone. So it ends with this very unresolved ending in Eisenstein's mind, but with this victory that was supposed to justify things.
That's what I was going to say, because and it sounds very neatly in Russian. It's един, но один, so unified but alone. But those things rhyme, right? And we have this motive here when he needs friendship, and he loves those friends who betrayed him. And this was another link to Stalin, who was killing off his friends, and of course he felt this loneliness. And I don't know how Eisenstein guessed it or not, but of course it was something that Stalin did not want to be reminded of.
As I said to Mr. Bagrov before, I saw a print of this 45 years ago. In that print, I remember this final scene being included in that print. So was this part of the Criterion collection originally, or what print were we watching in 45 years ago? That Criterion? Okay. Oh, okay, good. I'm not imagining it. It was there. Okay, thanks.
But this scene could never be, in the middle of part 2. It could only be shown as a supplement, like we did today.
One quick question, which is, do people in Russia watch this movie today?
Today.
In the current generation?
Well, I mean,
are people watching this movie?
I would say that there is a habit, unfortunately, of watching old films too much. But those who do watch old film, they know it very well. It is a classic, an absolute classic, of course.
Thank you so much.